In the depths of antiquity, when the world was young and full of wonders, stories unfolded that have reached us across millennia. It was a time when mighty gods walked freely among mortals, when heroes faced truly impossible tasks, and ordinary people lived their simple lives under the gentle Mediterranean sun. We are about to delve into those quiet, almost imperceptible moments that history often overlooks. Moments of anticipation, intense labour, and deep reflection that preceded great events. Deep beneath the earth's crust, in forges untouched by sunlight, one could almost feel the unseen weight of forged chains. There, in eternal darkness, the Cyclopes toiled, their colossal hands shaping each link of metal with astonishing precision. These shackles were destined to contain the most formidable and dangerous creature ever to appear in the world. But before delving into the climax of this grand struggle, the narrative must begin at its origins, from the moment the earth itself was consumed by righteous wrath. Gaia, the progenitor of all existence, Mother Earth, could no longer silently witness the endless suffering of her children. The Titans, her mighty giant firstborn, had been defeated and cast into the gloomy depths of Tartarus, the greatest abyss of the underworld, by the deeds of Zeus and his brothers. For years Gaia had felt their torment echoing within her very stony core. Every thunderclap from Zeus seemed like a mockery, and every flash of lightning a painful reminder of the brutal massacre of her kin. And then, in her ancient mind, a decision ripened to create something unprecedented, something that could shake the power and challenge the almighty king of the Olympian gods himself. Deep within the planet, in mysterious abyssal caves where furious earthly heat melted stone, forming bubbling pools of molten rock, Gaia began her creation. She fused the very flesh of the earth with raging fire, ancient wrath with unfathomable power, forging a creature so monstrous and terrifying that even the progenitor herself wondered if she had exceeded all conceivable limits. This offspring was named Typhon, and his appearance and power were unparalleled in all creation. Imagine a colossal giant whose head reached the very stars. His colossal arms stretched from one shore of the Mediterranean to the other. Instead of ordinary fingers, he had countless serpent heads, each hissing and snapping, controlled by its own malevolent mind. Typhon's eyes burned like glowing coals from a hellish forge, and when he made a sound, his voice shook the world like the simultaneous eruption of 100 volcanoes. However, within this grand saga lay a peculiarity that made it wonderfully suited for quiet contemplation. Most of Typhon's existence was not spent in a whirlwind of epic battles. A significant portion of his time was devoted to simple being, to slow growth, to patient waiting, to understanding the very essence of existence in a world that suddenly seemed strangely small to him. When Typhon first erupted from the earth's depths, he did not immediately rush into battle with Zeus. Instead, he spent days acclimating, absorbing the surrounding reality. One could only imagine how unusual and new this must have been for him. For the first time, the boundless sky appeared before his eyes. For the first time, he felt the touch of the wind, real, moving air caressing his colossal form. He felt the sunlight warming his stony skin. Typhon strode slowly across the land, and with each step, entire mountains crumbled, not because he sought to destroy them, but simply because his immense size prevented the earth from properly supporting his unimaginable weight. Villages for miles around emptied as people felt the earth tremble beneath the footsteps of the unknown. But Typhon barely noticed these minuscule settlements. His gaze was fixed skyward, where he studied the abode of the gods. Mount Olympus majestically rose in the distance, and even from such a distance, Typhon sensed the unearthly power emanating from it. He caught the faint scent of ambrosia, heard the barely perceptible echoes of divine laughter, felt the electric tension that invariably surrounded Zeus, and slowly, almost silently, his true purpose became crystal clear. A notable feature of ancient Greek mythological monsters was that they often weren't malicious in the conventional sense of the word. Typhon was not driven by pure malice or hatred for their own sake. He was the embodiment of a clear, unwavering purpose. His progenitor had created him to fulfill one specific mission: to overthrow the order established by Zeus and to ask a question no one had dared utter aloud until then. Who gave you the right to rule all existence? Thus, Typhon began his unhurried yet relentless ascent toward Olympus. First, however, he had to test the limits of his incredible power. He started small, breathing fire onto forests, watching them instantly ignite like dry torches. He dipped his serpentine fingers into the ocean waves, and the water around them boiled, hissing and evaporating. He emitted what he considered a quiet growl, and listened as the sound echoed like thunder across 3 mountain ranges, shaking the surrounding areas. The Olympian gods, of course, could not fail to notice his appearance. It was impossible for a creature the size of a mountain to move through the world unnoticed. However, their first reaction was not immediate attack. It was watchful observation. Zeus stood on his celestial balcony, gazing at this new, colossal threat. And for the first time in centuries, he experienced a feeling he had almost forgotten: uncertainty. It wasn't panic, but the realization that the coming battle would be fundamentally different from all previous encounters. Beside him stood Hera, surprisingly silent. Even she, who had opposed Zeus for centuries in countless intrigues and complex plots, now clearly saw that Typhon represented something far more significant than their usual family quarrels. The question was not who would occupy one throne or another. At stake was the very existence of their entire world, of all cosmic order. The other gods also began to prepare, but not for battle. Their preparation was for retreat. And at this moment, the narrative takes on an almost ironic tone. These powerful, immortal beings who ruled over every aspect of life on earth gathered and hastily fled to Egypt. There they assumed the forms of animals and hid from the monstrous threat. Apollo, god of light and music, turned into a crow. Artemis, the untamed huntress, transformed into a graceful cat. Hermes, messenger of the gods, took the form of an ibis, perhaps because that guise seemed most dignified to him. Even the god of war himself, Ares, turned into a fish and swam away as fast as his new fins allowed. But Zeus could not allow himself to flee, not because he possessed greater courage than the other Olympians, but because he was king. Kings do not abandon their dominions, even if those dominions stretch to the heavens, and their enemy is a serpent-fingered giant capable of boiling the seas with a single breath. So Zeus remained on his throne and waited. The battle, when it finally erupted, shook the entire world to its foundations. However, Before delving into the description of the most grandiose duel, it is worth noting the preparation that preceded it. For often the anticipation and meticulous planning prove far more captivating than the event itself. Zeus prepared for the inevitable confrontation for 3 days. He diligently polished his lightning bolts, bringing them to a perfect shine, sharpened his thunder, making it even more striking, and honed his aiming skills. He carefully selected food, choosing that which would grant him unprecedented strength without burdening his body. He plunged into a long, serene sleep, accumulating energy for what he sensed would be the longest and most grueling battle of his immortal life. Typhon, meanwhile, also conducted his preparations, but did so in his own unique way, in accordance with his monstrous nature. He sat by the boundless ocean, dipping his serpentine fingers into the water, allowing them to acclimate to the sensation of movement and fluid resistance. He practiced his thunderous roar, starting with a barely audible hiss and gradually increasing the volume, until sea creatures fled in panic to the deepest ocean trenches. He tested his fiery breath on uninhabited islands, meticulously learning to control the temperature and direction of this incinerating stream. Both adversaries understood that the outcome of this battle would determine the very future of creation. Should Zeus triumph, the order he established would remain unbroken. The gods would continue to rule from Mount Olympus, mortals would live their lives below, and the natural laws governing the universe would remain unshakable and stable. If, however, Typhon prevailed, the world would plunge back into chaos. This would not necessarily be malicious or destructive chaos, but the primordial disorder that reigned before Zeus and his brothers ordered creation, dividing it into neat, predictable categories. It would be chaos where anything could happen, where natural laws were mere suggestions and mortals, gods, and monsters shared the same unpredictable and uncertain world. The battle itself, unfolding between the Titan and the King of Gods, lasted 7 long days. For 7 days lightning pierced the sky, visible from the most distant corners of the earth. For 7 days roars so deafening caused avalanches in mountain ranges hundreds of miles away. For 7 days the earth shook with such furious force that new islands rose from the ocean depths, and ancient, familiar lands submerged beneath the raging waves. But what was most remarkable about this grand struggle was not so much its dramatic peaks, but the quiet, barely perceptible moments that slipped between them. Brief pauses when both colossal combatants stopped to catch their breath, the way Zeus gazed upon the charred, scorched earth and, deep down, wondered about the true cost of this fight, and the way Typhon, raising his gaze to the stars, suddenly remembered that his progenitor, Gaia, had created him from the very same earth that had given birth to those distant, shimmering lights in the heavens. On the 7th day of this furious confrontation, Zeus managed to deliver a perfect, decisive blow. His most powerful lightning bolt, the embodiment of divine wrath, struck Typhon directly in the chest, and the colossal creature crashed to the ground, shaking it to its very foundations. However, Zeus did not celebrate his victory. Instead, he stood silently, gazing at his defeated foe, and something entirely unexpected awakened in his immortal soul, a deep, poignant sadness. Typhon did not perish. Gods and monsters in Greek myths do not meet an easy death, but he was definitively vanquished. And when Zeus commanded that those very special chains mentioned at the beginning of the narrative be brought, he realized a profound truth. victory and triumph are not always synonymous. The Cyclopes delivered their sombre masterpieces, chains forged from metal born in the hearts of dying stars, tempered in the tears of the earth itself, and blessed by forces far more ancient than any of the Olympian gods. These shackles were meant to hold not merely Typhon's colossal body. They were intended to bind his very essence, his indomitable ability to challenge the established cosmic order, forever imprisoning him within the planet's depths. As the heavy chains coiled around Typhon's colossal body, the giant, who had been silent during the struggle, finally spoke. His voice, once a thunderous roar, now a barely audible whisper, resonated in the air. "This is not the end," he uttered, and Zeus nodded in response. "I realize that," replied the Lord of Olympus. Both understood a truth that remained inaccessible to the other gods, who had hidden in distant Egypt. The chains could bind Typhon's physical form, but they were powerless against the question he embodied, a question that would echo through the ages, through every generation of gods and mortals to come, who decreed that all things should be arranged this way. Typhon was buried beneath Mount Etna, and this interment transformed the mountain into a fire-breathing volcano, erupting whenever the vanquished giant stirred in his eternal slumber. Even now, millennia later, when Etna awakens, some legends say it is Typhon dreaming of freedom, testing the strength of his ancient bonds. Zeus returned to Olympus, and the other deities came back from Egypt, resuming their customary lives as if nothing had happened. However, Zeus often stood on his balcony, gazing at the distant glow of Etna, and pondered what would happen when those chains finally crumbled. And in the quiet of your room tonight, as you drift into comfortable oblivion, you too might wonder, what happens when that which challenges all established order breaks free? What happens when the question no one dares to ask is finally voiced? The chains holding Typhon still retained the heat of the forge when the earth trembled once more. But this time, the cause was not the movement of a single colossal being. This time it was the sound of footsteps. Many, many footsteps, all moving in the same direction. Gaia had lost her great warrior. However, she had no intention of ceasing her grievances against Zeus and his kin. If one monster couldn't challenge the gods, perhaps an entire army could. So she delved deep into her most fertile valleys and began to cultivate a new race of children, the giants. They differed from Typhon, born of rage and fire. These giants came into being from patience and unwavering determination. They grew slowly, like ancient trees, reaching their full might over decades. And as they grew, they diligently learned. You see, Gaia had learned something important by observing Typhon's defeat. Brute force alone was not enough to stand against the gods. Her new children needed strategy, coordinated action, and most importantly, time. So the giants spent their childhood, which lasted about 50 years, studying their enemies. They observed the deities from hidden valleys, carefully noting their habits, their strengths and their weaknesses. They learned that Zeus was most powerful during storms, but became vulnerable in clear, windless weather. They discovered that Poseidon lost his power the further he moved from any body of water. They noticed that Hades very rarely left his underworld realm, which made his actions predictable. The giants were methodical in a way that made them perfect for such a soothing story. They were in no hurry. They planned, prepared, and practiced with the same persistent determination that a person might apply to a long, complex project. Their leader was Alcyoneus, a giant with the remarkable ability to become immortal as long as he remained on the land where he was born. This meant he could never leave his native valley to participate in battle, but it also meant he could coordinate the war from a position of absolute safety. Think about that for a moment. The leader of this great rebellion against the gods was in essence chained to his own backyard. He could send messages, make plans, and issue orders, but he could not actually participate in any of the battles he orchestrated. There's something both tragic and comical about that situation. Another giant, the unfortunate Porphyrion, upon seeing Hera from afar, fell in love with her. His entire motivation for participating in the war wasn't actually to challenge Zeus's authority. He simply desired to capture Hera's attention. Of course, attempting to impress someone by waging war against her spouse was likely not the most well-thought-out approach. But the giants were not known for their emotional intelligence. Ephialtes and Otus, two giant brothers, had an even more specific goal. They wanted to abduct Artemis and Aphrodite and make them their wives. Their plan involved building a mountain tall enough to reach Olympus by piling 3 different peaks on top of each other. They spent years moving stones one by one, creating what was essentially the world's most ambitious landscaping project. The slowness of their work was almost meditative. Day after day, the two brothers awoke before dawn, ate a simple breakfast of bread and honey, and then spent 14 hours carrying stones up the mountainside. They spoke little during these work sessions, communicating mostly through grunts and gestures. In the evenings, they sat by their fire, looking at their growing mountain, and made small adjustments to their plans. "Perhaps we need the peak to be a little more to the left," Ephialtes would say. Otus would agree. And the next day they would shift their entire project slightly westward. It took them 3 years to build their mountain staircase, and by the time they finished, they had almost forgotten why they were building it in the first place. The work itself had become more important than the goal. Meanwhile, the gods observed all this activity with growing apprehension. It was one thing to face a single enemy, even one as powerful as Typhon. It was quite another to face a coordinated army that had been planning its attack for decades. Zeus called a family meeting, which in the case of the Greek gods meant a great deal of arguing, accusations, and dramatic gestures. Hera accused Zeus of creating the situation by overthrowing the Titans. Poseidon suggested simply flooding the entire earth and starting over with new mortals who might be more grateful. Athena, ever practical, pointed out that they needed to understand what the giants actually wanted before they could figure out how to stop them. "What if we just give them some lesser deity?" Apollo suggested. "A few small islands to rule, perhaps some power over certain types of weather." "Absolutely not," Zeus replied. "If we start negotiating with rebels, every monster and lesser deity in the world will think they can make demands." Hermes, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the discussion, finally spoke. "I've been watching them," he said. "They're not like Typhon. They don't want to destroy everything. They just want respect. Recognition, I think." This observation led to a long, thoughtful silence, because respect was something the gods rarely felt compelled to give anyone outside their immediate family. The idea that these giants might have legitimate grievances was more unsettling than the idea that they were simply monsters bent on destruction. But before the gods could find a diplomatic solution, the war began. It began almost by accident. Hermes was delivering a message to a mortal king. when he flew too close to the giant's main camp. One of the younger giants, excited to finally see a god up close, threw a boulder at him. Not necessarily trying to hurt him, but more like a child throwing a ball to get someone's attention. The boulder missed Hermes, but destroyed a temple dedicated to Zeus that stood on a nearby hill. Zeus saw the destruction, assumed it was a deliberate attack, and responded with a lightning bolt that singed the hair of 3 different giants. And just like that, the war began. But this war was different from the short, intense battle with Typhon. This was a slow, grinding conflict that lasted for years. The giants had the advantage of size and strength, but the gods had the advantage of mobility and magic. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory. The giants would spend weeks arranging enormous boulders for a coordinated assault on Olympus. The gods responded by conjuring storms that made it impossible for the giants to see their targets. The giants would retreat into their caves to weather the storms. The gods used this time to repair any damage and plan their next move. Months would pass without any major engagements, only small skirmishes, brief encounters, and a great deal of waiting. During one of these quiet periods, something interesting happened. Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, was travelling through a valley when she encountered a group of young giants tending a garden. These giants were not preparing for war. They were growing vegetables. Demeter, whose job it was to help things grow, was fascinated by their techniques. The giants had devised a composting method that created incredibly rich soil. They had bred new varieties of beans that could grow in rocky soil. They had trained wild grapevines to produce fruit twice the size of normal grapes. Before she knew what she was doing, Demeter began to offer advice. "If you plant these carrots a little deeper, they'll grow straighter," she told a giant, who was probably young enough to be her great-great-great-grandchild if gods and giants reckoned relationships the way mortals did. "Really?" the giant asked, and there was such genuine curiosity in his voice that Demeter, goddess of fertility, for a moment forgot the enmity fate had prescribed for them. The entire day she devoted to teaching these colossal beings the intricacies of agriculture, crop rotation, the importance of soil pH, and the optimal moon phases for planting various crops. The giants absorbed every word intently, asked deep, meaningful questions, and in gratitude offered her their simple bread and cheese. It was perhaps the most peaceful day Demeter had experienced since the beginning of this grueling war. However, when she returned to sacred Olympus and recounted her encounter to the other deities, Zeus, the supreme god, erupted in furious rage. "You consort with the enemy," he thundered, accusing her. "They're just gardeners," Demeter calmly countered. "They grow food." "How does that make them my adversaries?" This heated argument revealed an uncomfortable truth that none of the gods wished to openly acknowledge. They themselves weren't entirely sure of the true reasons for this protracted war. The giants yearned for recognition and respect. The gods, on the other hand, sought to preserve their absolute power. But power over what exactly? And why, in this vast world, could there not be a place for both majestic gods and mighty giants? Unfortunately, wars once begun acquire their own inertia, continuing even when the participants start to doubt their purpose. Conflicts often persist because it takes far more courage to end them than to continue them. The war, contrary to expectations, did not end with a grand battle, but with a mysterious prophecy, The oracle proclaimed that the giants could only be decisively defeated if a mortal warrior fought alongside the gods. This meant Zeus had to find a human hero valiant enough to stand against mountain-sized foes. The choice fell upon Heracles, a demigod half-human, who had already proven his indomitable courage in countless adventures. But even with Heracles among the Olympians, the final victory proved less dramatic than one might imagine. One by one, the giants were defeated in a series of smaller, scattered engagements. Alcyoneus, for instance, was cunningly lured from his native valley, where he lost his immortality. Porphyrion fell under the combined assault of Zeus and Heracles. The giant brothers Ephialtes and Otus were slain by Artemis, not for their attempted abduction, but because they accidentally destroyed one of her sacred groves while building their mountain. Thus the war ended quietly, almost mundanely, without an epic finale. The surviving giants retreated to distant islands and deep, hidden caves, where, legends say, they reside to this day. Some stories claim they never again rose in rebellion against the gods, but also never fully accepted their defeat. Zeus proclaimed victory and returned to his undisputed rule of the world. However, something subtly changed. The gods were no longer so absolutely certain of their power. They realized that power based solely on might could always be challenged by someone more powerful, more determined, or more patient. And in the quiet moments between thunderclaps, as Zeus stood alone on his balcony, gazing at the world, he sometimes wondered if Demeter had been right. Perhaps the giants weren't enemies at all. Perhaps they were simply different. As you drift to sleep tonight, one might reflect on the gardens those young giants had tended with such care. Somewhere in a hidden valley, tomatoes and carrots likely still flourish in soil enriched by ancient composting methods. And perhaps that is a far more lasting victory than any battle, deep beneath majestic Mount Olympus, where the rock itself pulses red with primordial heat burning since the dawn of the world, lies a workshop that never falls silent. The clang of the hammer echoes through vast chambers carved from living stone, and the air shimmers with such intensity that everything around seems submerged in water. Here, Hephaestus toils, and his story begins not with the grand battles previously explored, but with something far quieter and profoundly human, the simple yet insatiable need to create beauty. Hephaestus was not only the smith of the gods, but also their outcast. At his birth, his mother Hera looked upon him and felt only deep disappointment. He lacked Apollo's beauty, Ares' strength, or Athena's wisdom. He was small, his legs seemed weak, and his face appeared made more for squinting into fire than for smiling at palace receptions. So Hera committed an act that seems unthinkable to comprehend. She threw her own infant from the heights of Olympus. Imagine a fall lasting an entire day, tumbling through fluffy clouds and past soaring birds, watching the world below grow larger and larger until you finally splash into the boundless ocean near the small island of Lemnos. Imagine being rescued by kind-hearted sea nymphs who carry you to their underwater caves and care for you as their own child. The sea nymphs Thetis and Eurynome were entirely unconcerned with Hephaestus's appearance. Far more important to them was that he was curious, clever, and incredibly driven. While other children indulged in play, Hephaestus meticulously studied the structure of shells, explored intricate patterns in corals, and tried to understand how crabs managed to regrow new claws. By the age of 10, he had already built his first forge from volcanic rocks and driftwood washed ashore. It might not have looked impressive, but it worked. He learned to control fire not through magic, but through painstaking observation and patient practice. He discovered which types of seaweed, dried and burned, produced the hottest flame. He figured out how to use tidal pools as natural cooling baths for hot metal. The nymphs watched him work for hours without uttering a word. There was something hypnotic about the rhythm of his hammer, the way he could look at a piece of raw metal and see a finished tool within it. His work demanded a kind of focused attention that was akin to deep meditation. When Hephaestus turned 16, he created something that changed everything, a golden throne, so magnificent it seemed to capture sunlight and hold it within itself. The throne was covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed from different angles. Flowers that seemed to bloom and close, birds that seemed to preen, waves that looked as though they truly flowed. He sent this throne to Olympus as a gift for his mother. Hera was delighted when the mysterious gift arrived. She had no idea who sent it, but couldn't resist sitting down to examine the intricate craftsmanship more closely. The throne was so comfortable, so perfectly designed for her exact size and preferences, that she settled in for a long, luxurious rest. That's when she discovered the trap. The throne was engineered with invisible golden chains that activated the moment anyone sat down. The more Hera struggled to rise, the tighter the chains cinched. She was trapped, ensnared by the most beautiful piece of furniture ever crafted. The other gods tried every possible means to free her. Zeus struck the throne with lightning. The chains absorbed the electricity and used it to become even stronger. Poseidon flooded the throne room. The water simply flowed around Hera, leaving the golden fastenings unaffected. Ares tried to sever the chains with his sword. The blade shattered on impact. Finally, Hermes examined the throne more closely and discovered a small inscription, artfully hidden in the base, made by Hephaestus, son of Hera, with love and respect. Zeus immediately dispatched messengers to find this mysterious craftsman, and when they found him in his island workshop, they were astonished by the sight that greeted them. Hephaestus had spent years crafting a forge that was part workshop, part art gallery, and part engineering lab. The walls were hung with tools that seemed to organize themselves. Hammers hung in perfect order by size. Chisels remained sharp without needing to be honed, and tongs automatically adjusted their grip based on what they held. The anvil was forged from a single piece of meteoric iron, fallen from space, and when struck, it emitted perfect musical tones. But the most impressive part of the workshop wasn't the equipment. It was the patience that permeated every project. Hephaestus worked on some pieces for decades, adding tiny details year after year, perfecting them with a dedication that comes only from a true love of one's craft. There were bells made of metal so thin it was almost transparent, tuned to melodies that shifted with the weather. There was a mirror that showed not a person's current appearance, but how they would look if they were perfectly healthy and utterly happy. There was a lamp that burned without fuel, its flame powered by the craftsman's own contentment with his work. The messengers found Hephaestus in the midst of his daily routine. He awoke before dawn, as he had every day for years, and began by cleaning his tools, not because they were dirty, but because the quiet, repetitive action helped him focus his mind on the work ahead. He ate a modest breakfast, slices of bread, cheese, a few fruits, and a sip of water, while simultaneously poring over the designs he had created the previous evening. These sketches were not blueprints in the modern sense, rather, they were a kind of poetry, articulated in the language of metal and flame. They hinted at elegant curves, anticipating boundless possibilities, confident angles symbolizing unyielding strength, and precise dimensions alluding to perfect balance. After finishing his meal, he kindled his forge and spent several moments silently observing the dance of the fire. He did nothing but contemplate the movement of the flames, the variety of hues they created, the sounds they made as they consumed different fuels. This daily meditation revealed to him secrets of the fiery element that most gods, despite their incomparably greater power, never knew. When the messengers explained the reason for their visit, Hephaestus thoughtfully inclined his head. "She wishes to be freed from the throne," he inquired. "Yes," they confirmed. "Zeus commands you to immediately grant her freedom." Hephaestus smiled, and in that smile there was no malice, only the quiet satisfaction of a man whose plan had unfolded exactly as intended. "I will free her," he stated. "But first I wish to visit Mount Olympus. I want to see my family." The messengers agreed, though they doubted Zeus would be pleased with these terms. When they returned to Olympus with Hephaestus, the gods were struck by what they saw. They expected to encounter either a terrifying monster or a humble supplicant. Instead, before them stood a calm, dignified master who surveyed their majestic halls with the critical eye of someone assessing workmanship. "Interesting architecture," Hephaestus remarked, examining the gilded columns supporting the throne room. "However, these joints could be stronger, and the proportions are slightly off. The ceiling needs to be either 3 feet higher or 5 feet lower to achieve the correct acoustic balance." He approached Hera, who was still trapped in her golden throne, continuing to struggle fruitlessly against the invisible bonds. "Hello, Mother," he said softly. Hera looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time since his birth. She saw the burns on his hands, evidence of long years working with fire. She noticed how his shoulders had developed from wielding heavy hammers. In his eyes she read intelligence and patience, and something else entirely unexpected: forgiveness. "I designed this throne to fit you perfectly," Hephaestus explained. "For months I studied you from afar, learning your exact measurements, your preferences, your habits. I aimed to create something that would make you feel like the queen you are." Hera's anger began to subside, replaced by confusion, then slowly morphing into shame. "The chains were necessary," Hephaestus continued, "for I knew you would never sit still long enough to hear what I had to say, if you had a choice." He touched a hidden lever in the armrest of the throne, and the golden chains dissolved like morning mist. "I seek no vengeance," he said. "I seek recognition. I want to be part of this family, not as the son you rejected, but as the craftsman who can create the tools you need." Zeus, who had been preparing to deliver some regal pronouncement, found himself speechless. He had expected drama, confrontation, divine justice. Instead, he witnessed something far more complex: a family learning to be a family. Hera slowly rose from the throne, testing her newfound freedom. Then she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She embraced her son. "Forgive me," she whispered, and those two words changed everything. From that day on, Hephaestus became the official craftsman of Olympus, but he did not move his workshop to the mountain. Instead, he expanded his island forge and connected it to Olympus with a network of tunnels that he carved himself. Working silently for months, tunneling through solid rock, these tunnels became legendary among the gods. They were perfectly straight, precisely the right size for comfortable walking, and illuminated by an eternal flame that Hephaestus had invented specifically for this project. The walls were smooth as glass, but never slippery. The air always remained fresh, despite the underground location, thanks to a ventilation system so ingeniously designed that no one else could comprehend its workings. In his expanded workshop, Hephaestus set about creating the tools and weapons that would define the era of the gods. Here, Zeus's lightning bolts were forged, each individually crafted and balanced for maximum precision. Poseidon's trident was forged from metal consecrated with seawater from 7 different oceans. Artemis's silver bow was crafted from moonlight that had somehow been rendered solid without losing its flexibility. But Hephaestus also created more humble items, kitchen utensils for Demeter that ensured food cooked evenly and stayed fresh longer, musical instruments for Apollo that produced sounds of impossible beauty, gardening tools that helped plants grow stronger and more resilient. He created golden robots that served as his assistants. These mechanical beings could think and feel, but were perfectly content to spend their existence assisting in the forge work. These robots were not slaves. They were colleagues who simply happened to be made of metal instead of flesh. Every item that emerged from Hephaestus's forge was perfect, but not in the cold, flawless sense one might expect. They were perfect because they were ideally suited for their purpose, designed with such a profound understanding of their users' needs that they seemed to anticipate what was desired before it was even requested. And throughout all this work, Hephaestus maintained the same quiet, daily routine he had developed as a young exile on his island. He awoke before dawn, cleaned his tools, ate his simple breakfast, and spent time watching the fire before beginning his day's work. The gods learned that when they needed something truly important created, they didn't just place an order with Hephaestus and expect immediate results. Instead, they would visit his workshop, discuss their needs, and then patiently wait as he thought, planned, and meticulously crafted exactly what they required. And as you drift to sleep tonight, you might imagine the sound of that distant hammering still echoing through the tunnels beneath Olympus. Somewhere in the darkness, Hephaestus is still working, still creating, still transforming raw materials into objects of beauty and purpose, with the same patient dedication he learned as a child when he fell from the heavens and found his calling in the depths of the earth. While Hephaestus forged gold into impossible forms in his divine smithy, far below, in the sun-drenched hills of Greece, a completely different kind of work was taking place. Work that required no magic, no divine power, just the steady rhythm of human hands doing what human hands have always done, coaxing life from the earth. Meet Alexios, though history will never record his name. He was a farmer in Attica, the region surrounding Athens, in those times when gods still walked openly among mortals. His story is not found in any epic poem or painted on a temple wall, but it is the kind of story that truly built the world where heroes could exist. Alexios owned 12 acres of land that his grandfather had cleared on a hillside covered with wild olive trees. The soil was thin and rocky, the kind that made you grateful for every plant that managed to grow. His house was small, 2 rooms built of local stone, with a roof of clay tiles he had made himself during long, hot summers. Every morning Alexios awoke before dawn, not because he set any alarm, but because 40 years of farming had trained his body to recognize the precise moment the sky began to shift from black to deep blue. This was the best time to work, cool enough that he wouldn't be exhausted by midday, yet light enough to see what he was doing. His first task was always the same, to walk his fields slowly, to observe. Not yet to work, just to observe. To inspect the olive trees for signs of disease or insect damage. To check the grain for damage from the wind that had raged the previous evening. To examine the grapevines to see if new shoots needed tying to their supports. This daily inspection took about an hour, and to anyone watching, it might have seemed tedious. Alexios walked very slowly from plant to plant, stopping occasionally to touch a leaf or smell the soil. But this hour of careful observation was the foundation of everything else he did. A good farmer, as he learned from his father, sees problems when they are still small enough to be easily managed. After completing his morning inspection of his lands, Alexios headed to his home, where his customary breakfast awaited him. Fresh bread, baked by him the previous evening, rich cheese from his 3 goats, succulent olives harvested from his own olive trees, and the purest water from the well he had dug himself in his and Maria's first year of marriage. This diet, unchanged for nearly 2 decades, remained consistently cherished and delicious to him, for every component was the result of his own labour and effort. His wife, Maria, joined him at the table as the first rays of sun barely touched the hilltops. The care of the kitchen garden rested on her shoulders, from which fresh vegetables, medicinal herbs used for cooking and healing, and flowers, cultivated not for utility but purely for her own joy and visual delight, came to their table. During their meal they exchanged few words. After 25 years of marriage, they both understood that the morning hours were for silent preparation for the day ahead, not for lively conversation. However, their silence was not filled with emptiness or alienation. On the contrary, it was imbued with deep mutual understanding, sincere respect, and the calming comfort that arises from precisely knowing one's life partner's thoughts and feelings, without the need for verbal confirmation. After finishing his morning meal, Alexios began to gather his working tools. His arsenal consisted of exactly 7 indispensable agricultural implements: a plough forged by his father, a hoe whose handle he had replaced 3 times, a sharp sickle for harvesting grain, a special knife for pruning grapevines, a simple wooden rake, a sturdy digging stick, and a capacious basket, skillfully woven from flexible olive branches. These implements, perhaps lacking the exquisite beauty that distinguished the golden tools forged in Hephaestus's mythical smithy, nevertheless performed their purpose flawlessly, being perfectly adapted to their tasks. The plough, for instance, possessed an ideal weight, commensurate with Alexios's physical strength, and was perfectly sized for his fields. The hoe's handle, polished by decades of tireless labour, had conformed to the shape of his palm, fitting his hand as if custom-made. Each of these tools had its own strictly designated place in the modest shed located near his dwelling, and every evening, at the end of the workday, Alexios meticulously cleaned them and returned them to their places, in their unchanging positions. Such meticulousness was not a manifestation of obsessive behavior or eccentricity. Rather, it was embodied practical wisdom. For a farmer forced to spend precious minutes searching for his tools loses time, which in his profession is an unforgivable luxury. Although the nature of agricultural work changed with the seasons, its essence remained constant. It was slow, continuous, and vitally important labour. With the arrival of spring, Alexios began preparing the soil. His task was to walk behind his ox, skillfully guiding the plough through the earth softened by abundant winter rains. It was crucial for the furrows to be straight and even, deep enough to bury weeds, yet without disturbing the valuable earthworms that contributed to the soil's fertility. At first glance, ploughing might seem a simple task, but it demanded unflagging attention and concentration. The ox required sensitive and gentle guidance to maintain an optimal pace. Excessive haste would result in uneven furrows, while too much slowness risked the work not being completed before the soil completely dried out. Alexios constantly watched for stones that could damage the ploughshare, adjusted his grip depending on changes in terrain, and maintained impeccable balance when the plough suddenly hit hidden obstacles. Ploughing was invariably followed by sowing, which meant traversing the same fields again, but now to evenly scatter seeds, a process that appears easy and effortless from the outside, but in reality requires many years of hard work to achieve perfection and precision of movement. Too many seeds in one area would lead to fierce competition among seedlings for nutrients and light, while too few would result in a disappointingly meagre harvest. Summer marked a period of continuous vigilance and tireless care, weeding, meticulous watering, and an unyielding fight against pests. Alexios patrolled his fields twice a day, at dawn and dusk, manually removing weeds and bringing life-giving water to plants suffering from the oppressive heat. Perhaps this phase of agricultural labour was the most meditative. Hours of monotonous, repetitive manual labour, spent on his knees in the soil, where each plant was individually inspected and tended, immersed him in a special state. During these monotonous yet necessary tasks, Alexios's thoughts often drifted far away. He pondered his children, who had left home and gone to Athens in search of a better life and work. Images of his father, who had taught him to cultivate these very fields, resurfaced in his memory. He mused about future improvements he dreamt of making, contemplated the whims of the weather, and sometimes even mentally composed letters that were never destined to be written. However, an unwavering part of his consciousness remained entirely absorbed by the ongoing work, the feel of fertile soil between his fingers, the characteristic weight of each weed pulled from the earth, and the subtle nuances in shades of green that unmistakably indicated which plants were thriving and which were struggling to survive. The arrival of autumn crowned the annual cycle of agricultural labour, bringing with it the long-awaited harvest, a well-deserved reward for painstaking efforts. However, even this culminating stage of harvesting was largely associated with quiet, yet extremely meticulous labour, including cutting grain with smooth, rhythmic swings of the sickle, carefully gathering the cut stalks into tight sheaves, loading these sheaves onto a cart, and their subsequent transport to the threshing floor for further processing. The process of threshing was one of the few moments in a farmer's life when his labour took on an almost celebratory tone. Alexios spread the dried grain stalks on his stone threshing floor, and then led an ox in a circle, allowing the animal to trample the grain, separating the valuable seeds from the empty stalks. Although this work still required significant physical effort, in the repetitive circular motion, in the gradual formation of a mound of clean grain, a clear testament to the success of the entire year's labour, lay a deep and unparalleled satisfaction. The winter months arrived as a period of relative calm, yet this calm by no means signified idleness. During this time, Alexios dedicated himself to repairing farm implements, meticulously maintaining his buildings, and detailed planning for the upcoming year. In the evenings, he would sit by the warm hearth, carefully sifting through seeds diligently saved from the last harvest, and making crucial decisions about which fields and with what crops to sow in the next season. Such decisions were far more multifaceted and complex than they might appear at first glance. Different crops extracted different nutrients from the soil, so Alexios had to rotate them with exquisite precision to maintain the land's fertility and health. Certain plant varieties yielded better harvests under specific weather conditions, compelling him to make the most informed assumptions regarding the climatic features of the coming year. Some crops promised greater profit, but also carried greater risk. Consequently, he had to masterfully balance the prospect of significant gain against the threat of total crop failure. All these complex calculations were performed by him without a single written record, relying solely on deep knowledge passed down through generations and enriched by his own many years of practical experience. Alexios was illiterate, and in his life there had never been a pressing need for it. Nevertheless, he possessed a unique ability to predict weather changes merely by observing cloud formations, to accurately estimate the required amount of seeds for a field of any size, and to calculate fair prices for various crops with astonishing precision, without resorting to numbers in our conventional understanding. His wisdom and knowledge were embodied in his hands, eyes, sense of smell and touch. He unfailingly knew how healthy soil felt, what the rustle of ripe grain sounded like in the wind, and what aroma filled the air, heralding the approach of rain. On long winter evenings, Alexios and Maria spent time together, attending to household chores by the soft light of olive oil lamps. She expertly spun the wool of her sheep, transforming it into strong thread, and then wove this thread into cloth for their simple garments.